conference hall erupted with chaos as alarms blared, echoing like sirens of doom through steel walls and glass ceilings. Daniel Gray said, "This cannot be happening," his voice sharp, yet tremoring with disbelief. Screens lit up with red warnings, each headline screaming of betrayal and collapse. The empire he built in 2 decades seemed to unravel in seconds, power slipping like sand through clenched fists. Board members shouted over each other, fear cutting into their words like broken glass. Lydia Cole said, "Daniel, you have to act now before they destroy you," her tone urgent, her eyes fixed on him. Cameras flashed from outside the tinted windows, reporters clawing for every scrap of scandal. Daniel slammed his hand on the polished mahogany table, the sound like a gunshot that silenced the room. He said, "Find out who orchestrated this," his command laced with rage and desperation. Betrayal, sabotage, conspiracy, all colliding in one unbearable moment. Trust disintegrated instantly, and Daniel stood isolated, the world demanding his next move. The boardroom fell into a suffocating silence after Daniel's command, but the air carried unspoken accusations. Lydia whispered that the markets had already begun freefall, each second carving millions from their worth. Daniel paced like a predator trapped in glass, his reflection fractured by neon warnings still pulsing from the wall screens. One director muttered that investors were calling for his resignation, and the words sliced through the silence like a blade. Daniel stopped, his jaw set, eyes burning with fury and disbelief. He said, "If I step aside, we lose everything." The quiet murmurs of dissent grew heavier, feeding the sense that trust was crumbling fast. Shadows of betrayal darkened the faces around him, loyalty dissolving like sugar in acid. The outside world thundered in, as news feeds ignited every device within reach. Journalists reported live from the storm-slick streets, their voices frantic as they declared the empire's collapse. Daniel watched through tinted glass, his empire reduced to scandalous headlines. Lydia urged him to address the crisis before the story hardened into truth, but Daniel shook his head, refusing to yield to public hysteria. He said, "They will not dictate the end of my story." His words were defiant, yet his shoulders betrayed the weight of unraveling power. The crowd outside swelled, their chants rising against the glass walls like an approaching tide. Lydia stood closer now, her voice steady but edged with fear, telling Daniel that his enemies would strike while he stood paralyzed. She urged a counterattack before the rival empire cemented its dominance. Daniel, still unmoving, stared at the glowing screens, as if reading a death sentence. He said, "Every ally I trusted is now a suspect." His tone carried both bitterness and sorrow. The board members shifted uneasily, none daring to meet his eyes, the silence drenched in guilt. Shadows thickened in the corners of the room, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against him. When the storm outside finally softened, it revealed only the deeper storm within. Daniel stood alone at the head of the vast boardroom table, his reflection fractured in its polished surface. Lydia lingered near the window, her voice softer now, urging him not to surrender to despair. But Daniel's silence screamed louder than words, the weight of isolation pressing into his shoulders. He said finally, "Trust is gone." The words fell like stones into the silence, sealing the fracture between him and everyone else. The room that once symbolized victory now felt like a cage closing in. The markets collapsed like dominoes, each second sending another wave of panic across the trading floors. Lydia Cole reported that shares had dropped 15% within an hour, her voice strained. Daniel Gray stared at the ticker on the glowing screen, watching his empire bleed value in red streaks. His jaw clenched as a director muttered that investors were preparing to abandon ship. Daniel slammed his fist onto the table and said, "We will not let vultures dictate our future." Yet the silence afterward revealed how little faith remained in his words. The atmosphere grew suffocating, numbers tumbling faster than his thoughts. Shadows of ruin stretched across every surface, each screen echoing betrayal, each whisper promising collapse. The rival empire struck like a blade, its leader Gregory Kane broadcasting live from his glossy tower. His smirk carried venom as he declared the downfall of Grey Enterprises inevitable. Lydia warned Daniel that Kane's words were shaping the market faster than their defenses could react. Daniel's face hardened, his silence heavier than iron, as he realized the rival had seized the narrative. "He thinks he can bury me alive," Daniel said, his tone dripping with restrained rage. Outside, the city glowed with news feeds repeating Kane's broadcast, the world consuming the fall as spectacle. It was not just business. It was war declared in full view of millions. The walls of the boardroom pulsed with tension as Lydia begged Daniel to craft a counter-strategy. She said the investors would abandon him unless he seized control of the narrative. Daniel paced like a restless lion, each step echoing on polished marble. He muttered that betrayal surrounded him, and that even allies could not be trusted. Lydia gripped the table edge, her knuckles whitening, as she pleaded that silence was surrender. Daniel stopped abruptly, locking eyes with her, and said, "I will not crawl to beg for mercy." His words shook with defiance, but the weight in his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Around them, the board members whispered like vultures circling a wounded animal. Whispers of betrayal grew louder in corridors beyond the glass walls. Rumors snaked through every floor of the company, feeding paranoia that Daniel's leadership was crumbling. Lydia told him that even his closest allies might already be feeding Kane information. Daniel narrowed his eyes, rage simmering beneath controlled composure. He said, "Someone in this room is selling me out." The words froze the air, each director stiffening under the weight of accusation. Fear flickered in glances, exchanged across the polished table. No one admitted guilt, yet the silence was confession enough. Shadows stretched long, carrying with them the sense that trust was not just broken, but weaponized. An emergency staff meeting unfolded in the vast auditorium. Hundreds of employees gathered in silence. The hum of fear filled the air as Daniel stepped onto the stage, the spotlight casting long shadows across his face. His voice carried strength as he declared the company would survive, but whispers in the crowd spoke louder. Lydia stood at the edge, scanning expressions, seeing only doubt reflected back. Daniel said, "This empire was built to last," his words firm, yet every syllable sounded brittle under the pressure. Employees exchanged glances, uncertain whether to believe or abandon him. The moment was no rally. It was a trial of faith he was already losing. In the dim corridors of the tower, whispers traveled faster than light, weaving webs of betrayal. A trusted director met secretly with Gregory Kane, his loyalty already sold for promises of power. Daniel Gray sensed the fracture but had no proof to hold. Lydia Cole urged him to watch closely, saying the betrayal would soon reveal itself. Daniel's voice cracked like thunder when he muttered, "One knife in the dark can kill an empire." Fear laced his words, but beneath the fear burned fire. Trust was dissolving, and even familiar faces wore shadows now. The empire no longer fell to rivals alone. It was crumbling from within, one betrayal at a time. Daniel entered the control room, only to find reports missing, numbers falsified, and accounts drained. He slammed the folder shut, veins visible on his temple. Lydia warned that someone was bleeding the empire dry from within. Daniel growled, "They want me blind while they carve out my heart." His fury burned brighter than the red alerts flashing across screens. The silence that followed was colder than betrayal itself. Lydia's eyes darted nervously to the door, as though danger lurked just beyond it. Papers littered the floor like the remnants of trust itself, shredded and unrecognizable. The truth was undeniable. Someone close was orchestrating destruction. The tension broke when Julia Hayes, once an overlooked manager, rose to speak in the meeting. Her voice carried weight unexpected, cutting through whispers like a blade. Daniel and the directors turned as she declared that leadership's failures had doomed them. Some smirked at her boldness, but others leaned in, seeing her strength. Lydia's eyes widened as she realized Julia might be more dangerous than she appeared. Daniel said, "Careful whose fire you light, Julia," his tone sharp, but she did not flinch. The room shifted, as power briefly tilted toward the underdog, the unassuming figure who dared challenge giants. Later that night, Daniel confronted his CFO, Richard Hale, demanding answers about the missing funds. Richard feigned innocence, his eyes calm but too calm to trust. Daniel slammed the desk, roaring that betrayal would not stay hidden. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly as though daring Daniel to find proof. Lydia stood silently by the door, her expression twisted with suspicion. "If you're guilty, I'll burn you out of this empire," Daniel growled. The silence stretched into a blade between them, tension so thick it seemed the air itself could shatter. Trust was gone, only war remained. The boardroom splintered into factions, voices raised, and tempers igniting like wildfire. Half of the directors demanded Daniel's resignation, while others defended him with fading strength. Lydia whispered that the walls were closing in, the fracture now beyond repair. Daniel stood firm, refusing to yield even as chaos swirled around him. He said, "If I fall, this company burns with me." His declaration shook the room, silencing some but enraging others. The empire, once united by ambition, now crumbled into clashing ambitions, betrayal wrapped in every word. Daniel's empire was no longer a fortress. It was a battlefield, every corner soaked in distrust. Daniel Gray sat in a dim lounge, the silence broken only by the crackle of a fireplace. Across from him sat William Carter, the disillusioned mentor, once a titan of the same empire. William's eyes carried the weight of past failures as he told Daniel, "Ambition always demands blood." Daniel stared at the flames, his face hardened yet weary, asking if redemption was ever possible in a world built on betrayal. William shook his head slowly, his voice low but sharp, saying ambition never forgives. Daniel clenched his jaw, torn between rage and fear, as though hearing his own funeral. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting shadows of old victories and new defeats, warning of the cost Daniel would pay if he continued down this path. The shadow investor emerged in whispers, a force hidden behind layers of money and influence. Lydia Cole revealed that Catherine Doyle, a reclusive magnate, had been pulling strings for months. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he realized he had been fighting an enemy he could not see. Lydia said Catherine had funded Gregory Kane, orchestrating chaos to break him down. Daniel growled that shadows had always been deadlier than open enemies. The revelation cut deeper than betrayal. It was power he could not touch. Catherine's presence felt suffocating, a phantom whose wealth turned men into weapons. Daniel felt his empire crumble under unseen hands, every step forward sinking into quicksand. Gregory Kane appeared with a poisoned gift, offering Daniel a partnership cloaked in destruction. They met in a private skyscraper bar, neon lights glowing through rain-soaked windows. Gregory smirked, saying survival required surrender, his voice smooth and venomous. Daniel clenched his glass tightly, saying he would never kneel. Gregory leaned closer, whispering that one empire must fall for another to rise. The tension burned hotter than the whiskey between them, both men aware only one would leave victorious. Lydia watched silently from a corner, her face pale as the rival offered to buy Daniel's soul piece by piece. The air was thick with threat, disguised as charm, a deal carved in poison. Daniel discovered that the corporate spy was closer than he feared. A junior executive was caught transferring files, hands trembling as security dragged him into Daniel's office. Lydia hissed that this betrayal was no accident. It was planned from the inside. Daniel towered over the young man, demanding who bought his loyalty. The spy's silence confirmed everything Daniel already knew. Gregory Kane's shadow reached into every corner. Daniel slammed his hand on the desk, declaring treachery deserved no mercy. Fear etched itself into the spy's face as Daniel's fury burned hotter than reason. Out of reason. Lydia looked on, torn between outrage and horror. The lengths betrayal had spread. In the heart of the storm, an unexpected voice pierced the silence. Marcus Reed, a jaded employee, stood in the auditorium, his voice steady but filled with bitterness. He accused Daniel of leading them into ruin, saying ambition had devoured every ounce of humanity left in the company. Daniel's face hardened, his silence heavy as the crowd murmured agreement. Lydia's eyes widened at the boldness, yet the employees nodded, their faith already fractured. Marcus said, "This company is not a kingdom, it's a graveyard of broken promises." His words echoed through the room, shaking Daniel's resolve more than any rival's attack. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of rebellion from those he ruled. Dawn crept over the city as Daniel gathered the loyal few in a glass-walled war room. Lydia said, "We strike first or we bleed out," her tone steady and cold. Julia Hayes laid out a plan to stabilize cash and seize the media cycle. Daniel nodded, telling them the fight began now and would not end in mercy. He ordered audits, sweeps, and a purge of compromised channels. Lydia warned that Gregory would counter with spectacle and fear. Daniel said, "Then we give them truth sharpened to a blade." The team leaned in, seeing resolve replace exhaustion across his features. Outside, sirens wailed like a chorus to their vow. Within the room, silence condensed into purpose that felt almost sacred. By noon, the board assembled under brittle light, tension humming through every breath. Daniel opened with numbers that cut through rumor like a scalpel. He said stability returns when discipline returns, and he meant every word. Lydia slid forensic reports across the table, naming shell routes starved of cash. Murmurs shifted from outrage to wary focus as facts stacked like bricks. A director snapped that perception ruled markets, not ledgers. Julia replied that truth armed was strategy, not theater. Daniel warned there would be resignations before sunset or indictments by dawn. The room inhaled as if bracing for a blow. For once, fear served order rather than chaos. Gregory Kane unleashed a public blitz that painted Daniel as a relic clinging to power. The broadcast cut across every screen with predatory certainty and charm. Lydia said the messaging struck at fear, not sense, and that fear spreads fastest. Daniel told her to open their own channel with receipts and names. Julia stepped forward to host an investor briefing, forged from raw fact and calm tone. She said, "Judge us by verified action, not theater," and the line caught flame. The markets twitched, then steadied as doubt met data. Daniel felt momentum glance his way for the first time in days. Outside, rain hit glass like applause withheld and reconsidered. In corridors thick with whispers, influence pivoted toward Julia's rising steadiness. Some directors approached her with smiles that hid knives and favors. Lydia warned that admiration often came chained to intent. Daniel watched Julia pace the strategy bay, her confidence a fresh gravity. He said, "Your voice carried the day, but victory attracts weather." Julia answered that storms taught you which doors held. The team mapped contingencies that turned risk into roots. Even the air felt different, charged rather than choking. Hope moved through the building with careful feet. It did not erase dread, but it finally walked beside it. Night brought the counterstrike Daniel feared most, launched from inside the circle. An anonymous leak hit the feeds with doctored timelines and forged approvals. Lydia cursed softly, as screens spat poison dressed as proof. Daniel said, "This is Richard's handwriting with gloves on," and the room froze. Julia argued for a surgical response that named the fraud without feeding spectacle. Daniel agreed, promising to expose the root and the hand that guided it. He said, "We move before midnight, and we move without pity." The team fanned out like a silent brigade built on trust earned hard. In the dark glass, he saw not ruin but a road through fire. The storm broke when Richard Hale's treachery surfaced in full view. Documents traced every missing dollar back to his hand, laid bare in unforgiving clarity. Daniel Gray slammed the files on the table, his voice cutting like a blade. He said, "You bled this empire dry while smiling in my face." Richard smirked faintly, asking if Daniel expected loyalty in a world ruled by power. Lydia Cole's fury shook as she said betrayal was more corrosive than rivals. Silence drowned the boardroom, as betrayal finally wore a name. Daniel's rage was not just against Richard, but against the years he had trusted blindly. The empire's cracks were now scars carved by deceit, that could never be erased. The loyal confidant fractured next, revealed as a player in the silent war. Lydia's voice cracked as she admitted she had passed information to shield Daniel, but in doing so she strengthened their enemies. Daniel stared in disbelief, his trust collapsing like glass shattering. He said, "Every ally I held close has cut me open." Lydia begged that her betrayal was born of survival, not malice. Julia Hayes looked away, disgust plain in her eyes. The room froze as Daniel turned from Lydia, unable to speak further. The weight of betrayal hung heavier than any corporate coup. Even the walls felt poisoned, dripping with memories now tainted beyond repair. The cruelest revelation came like a blade to the heart. Daniel uncovered proof that Gregory Kane's funding tied back to Catherine Doyle, but deeper still, it was linked to a family trust. His own brother, Thomas Gray, had empowered the rival's rise. Daniel's chest tightened as though the empire itself had caved in on him. He whispered, "Blood sharpened the knife." Julia gasped, realizing betrayal was not corporate but bloodline. Lydia said nothing, shame silencing her completely. Daniel staggered for a moment, his strength breaking under the weight of truth. The empire was collapsing not only from treachery within the boardroom, but from blood that had turned against blood. The board convened for an emergency vote that descended into open warfare. Half the directors shouted for Daniel's removal, citing betrayal and chaos. The other half, though shaken, still clung to his authority. Voices clashed like weapons, echoes shattering against glass walls. Richard Hale smirked as he pushed for a coup, his words dripping poison. Daniel roared that betrayal would not dictate destiny, slamming his fist on the table. Julia Hayes stood tall, saying history would remember who voted for survival, and who voted for ruin. The room shook with fury, ambition and fear, the empire hanging by a single fragile thread. Gregory Kane arrived like a vulture over a corpse, his words tearing open Daniel's final defenses. He declared that Daniel's empire was ashes, and that even blood had abandoned him. Daniel's face darkened, his silence louder than fury. Julia whispered they still had options, but her words sounded frail in the storm. Gregory leaned in, smiling, and said, "You have already lost. The world just hasn't caught up yet." The blow shattered what little resolve Daniel clung to, leaving only fragments of rage and despair. Lydia lowered her gaze, ashamed of the ruins they now stood in. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of complete defeat. Dawn thinned the storm as Daniel stood at the window, the city humming like a distant engine. Lydia said, "The vote is in 2 hours," her voice even, her eyes worn. Julia placed a folder on the table and said, "Everything we need is here." Daniel breathed deep, feeling the crack and the steel inside the same breath. He said, "Today decides the truth I live with." Lydia answered that survival without a soul was only a slower death. Julia said, "We fight clean, and we accept the cost." The room held their resolve like a sealed vow. Outside, the skyline brightened, and the day refused to wait. The boardroom filled with cold light and colder faces. Gregory Kane waited like a verdict, smiling without warmth. Richard Hale sat stone still, hands folded. Daniel said, "We begin with facts," and the screen sprang alive. Julia walked the room through timelines like a surgeon tracing scars. "And?" Lydia said, each forged approval mapped to Richard's access. Murmurs cracked the silence, doubt turning its head. Gregory said, "Spectacle cannot save an empire." Daniel replied, "Only truth can." The air tightened as numbers pinned lies to the table. A vote card trembled in a director's hand. The vote began, cards raised like small knives. Daniel watched faces harden under duty and fear. Gregory said, "Legacy bows to momentum." Lydia whispered that courage would not be popular today. Julia said, "Stand with the company, not the storm." A director lowered his eyes and changed sides. The count swung, then steadied, then faltered. Daniel said, "If I fall, protect the people first." His words landed with a quiet finality that bent the room. The last card lifted, and silence hit like a hammer. The tally favored removal by a single breath. Daniel felt the weight and let it settle. Gregory said, "History corrects itself." Lydia stepped forward, eyes wet, saying she would fix what she broke. Julia said, "There is another path." Daniel lifted his gaze and said, "I choose to end this fight on my terms." He refused the coup and offered a resignation that named the fraud, the funders, and the safeguards set in place. He said, "Power without honor is ash." The room shifted, stunned by a victory that was not conquest. After the cameras died, quiet returned like rain on ash. Daniel walked the empty corridor, the empire behind him, and the city ahead. Lydia said, "I will carry this debt until it is paid." Julia said, "The work continues with or without crowns." Daniel touched the glass and said, "Let it go before it takes what is left of me." The skyline breathed, and the storm within him eased. He stepped into the elevator without looking back. The doors closed on ambition, leaving something harder and cleaner in its place.